The date is June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks over the English Channel, and the largest amphibious invasion in human history is about to begin. American troops prepare to storm Omaha and Utah beaches. But look to the east. There, alongside their American brothers in arms, British soldiers are loading into landing craft, checking their rifles one last time, knowing that in minutes they'll be charging into the German guns at Sword, Juno, and Gold beaches. The question that echoes through history isn't just about American valor that day, though it was extraordinary. It's about the fighting force that stood shoulder to shoulder with them. How capable was the British Army in World War II? The answer might surprise you. If you're ready to discover the untold truths about the Allies who fought alongside America's greatest generation, the warriors who held the line when freedom hung by a thread, hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the Second World War. Let's go back further. September 1939. Britain declares war on Nazi Germany after Hitler's invasion of Poland. The British Army that marches to war is a shadow. Years of budget cuts, outdated equipment, and a national desire to avoid another bloodbath like World War I have left Britain's military forces desperately unprepared. The British Expeditionary Force that deploys to France numbers just over 150,000 men. Compare that to the German Wehrmacht's nearly 4 million soldiers, backed by the most modern armor and aircraft in Europe. On paper, it looks like a mismatch, and in those early dark days, it was. May 1940. The German Blitzkrieg smashes through the Low Countries and crashes into France with devastating speed. The British Expeditionary Force, fighting alongside French and Belgian forces, faces the full fury of German mechanized warfare. Panzer divisions slice through defensive lines like a hot knife through butter. Stuka dive bombers scream from the sky. The coordination, the speed, the sheer violence of the German assault overwhelms the Allied defenses. Within weeks, the British Army is trapped. Their backs are to the sea at a little French port town called Dunkirk. Pause for a moment. Picture this. Over 300,000 British and Allied soldiers crowded on the beaches, German artillery pounding them from the surrounding hills, Luftwaffe fighters strafing the sand, and the dark waters of the Channel offering the only escape. This should have been the end, the complete destruction of Britain's professional army. Hitler's generals are already celebrating. The British Army finished before the real war even begins. But something happens at Dunkirk that defies every expectation. While the German generals hesitate, possibly ordered to pause by Hitler himself, possibly wanting to save their tanks for the push to Paris, a miracle unfolds. The Royal Navy, supported by hundreds of civilian boats, ferries those trapped soldiers across the Channel. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, ferry steamers, they come. And the soldiers who hold the perimeter, buying time for that evacuation? British infantry, fighting with desperate courage, outgunned, outmaneuvered, knowing they're probably going to die or be captured, they hold the line anyway, for days. When it's over, 338,000 soldiers make it back to Britain. The British Army has been evacuated, yes. They've lost nearly all their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, vehicles, everything. Winston Churchill stands before Parliament and delivers a speech that will echo through the ages. He calls it a miracle of deliverance, but warns it is not a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations, he says. But then he adds something else, something that speaks to the steel in the British spirit. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Empty words? Propaganda for a defeated nation? Many thought so. Even some American observers, watching from across the Atlantic, wondered if Britain could survive. The British Army, stripped of its equipment, facing the most powerful military machine in the world just 22 miles across the Channel, what chance did they have? But here's what those observers didn't know. Here's what makes the story of the British Army in World War II so remarkable. They were about to prove that capability isn't just about numbers or equipment. It's about will, about learning from mistakes, about evolution under fire, and about warriors who refuse to quit. Summer and fall of 1940, the Battle of Britain rages in the skies, with the Royal Air Force barely holding off the Luftwaffe's attempts to achieve air superiority for a German invasion. Down below, the British Army is rebuilding. American weapons and supplies begin arriving under the Lend-Lease program, a lifeline thrown by a nation not yet at war, but already understanding what's at stake. The United States, even before Pearl Harbor, recognizes that Britain's survival is essential to American security. Because if Britain falls, Hitler dominates all of Europe, and America faces a nightmare scenario. The British Army studies what went wrong in France. They analyze the German tactics, the integrated use of armor, infantry, and air power. They look at their own failures, poor communication, inadequate anti-tank weapons, and doctrine that hadn't evolved since 1918. And they begin to change. New divisions form, training intensifies. American M3 Lee tanks start arriving to supplement British production. It's a partnership beginning to take shape. Britain holding the line, America providing the arsenal, both knowing they'll need each other to win. But capability on the training ground means nothing until it's tested in battle. And that test comes in the deserts of North Africa. 1940 to 1943, the Western Desert Campaign. It's a war of movement across vast expanses of sand, where supply lines stretch for hundreds of miles and armored formations maneuver like fleets at sea. The British Army faces Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, commanding the German Afrika Korps and Italian forces. Rommel is brilliant, aggressive, and his forces are experienced and well-equipped. The early battles, disasters for the British. Rommel pushes them back across Libya, all the way to the gates of Egypt. Alexandria and the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India and the Far East, hang in the balance. But watch what happens. The British Army, learning from each defeat, begins to adapt. They bring in better commanders. Bernard Montgomery, Monty, takes command of the 8th Army in August 1942. He's methodical, careful, some say overcautious. But he understands something crucial. He understands logistics. He understands that in the desert, supply is everything. And he understands that the British soldier, properly equipped, properly trained, properly led, can fight. October 1942, El Alamein, the pivotal battle of the North African Campaign. Montgomery has 195,000 men, over 1,000 tanks, and massive artillery support. Rommel has fewer troops, fewer tanks, and his supply lines are being strangled by Allied naval and air power, including crucial American contributions. The British attack begins with a thunderous artillery barrage that lights up the desert night. Then the infantry and armor push forward into German minefields and prepared positions. It's not elegant, it's grinding, brutal attritional warfare. The British take heavy casualties, but they keep coming. Montgomery's plan, methodical and relentless, grinds down the Afrika Korps. Days of fierce fighting, tank duels at close range, infantry storming defensive positions, and slowly, inexorably, the German and Italian forces crack. Rommel, running low on fuel, ammunition, and men, has no choice. He retreats. El Alamein is the first major Allied land victory against Germany. Churchill will later say, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It's not quite true. There are more setbacks ahead, but the point stands. The British Army has proven it can beat the Germans. Man for man, gun for gun, when properly equipped and led, they can win. And just days after El Alamein, American forces land in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. Now it's not just the British anymore. The full weight of American industrial might and military power is entering the war in the West. Together, British and American forces squeeze Rommel's army between them. By May 1943, the Afrika Korps surrenders. Over 250,000 Axis prisoners taken. North Africa is liberated. The Mediterranean is open. And the stage is set for the invasion of Europe. But before D-Day, there's Italy. And Italy teaches both the British Army and their American allies some hard lessons. September 1943. British and American forces land at Salerno and begin the Italian campaign. The goal is to knock Italy out of the war, threaten Germany from the south, and tie down German divisions that might otherwise reinforce France. The problem? Italy is a defender's paradise. Mountains, rivers, narrow valleys, stone towns that become fortresses. The Germans, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, conduct a masterful fighting withdrawal up the Italian peninsula, making the Allies pay in blood for every mile. The British Army fights its way up the Adriatic coast. The Americans battle through the mountains toward Rome. Together, they face some of the most brutal combat of the war. Monte Cassino, Anzio, the Gothic Line. These aren't names of glorious victories. They're names of grim struggles where advances are measured in yards, where casualties mount sickeningly, where the only way forward is through direct assault against prepared German positions. Here's what matters. The British don't break. British infantry, often fighting alongside troops from across the Commonwealth, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, South Africans, slug it out with crack German paratroopers and panzer grenadiers. They take their losses, they learn, they develop new tactics for mountain warfare, and they keep pushing. It takes until June 1944 to reach Rome. The cost is staggering, but they do it. And all the while, they're preparing for the big show, Normandy. Return to June 6, 1944, D-Day. The British and Canadian forces landing on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches face just as deadly a reception as the Americans at Omaha. German bunkers, minefields, artillery, machine guns sweeping the beaches. The difference? The British beaches are defended somewhat less heavily than Omaha, and the British use specialized armor, Hobart's funnies they're called, modified tanks that can clear mines, lay bridges, and provide direct fire support during the landing. American ingenuity and British innovation, both trying to solve the same problem in different ways. The British push inland from their beaches with one crucial objective: Caen. Montgomery wants to take this city quickly, use it as a hinge for the entire Normandy campaign, draw the German panzer divisions toward the British sector so the Americans can break out on the right. Does it go according to plan? No. The Germans defend Caen ferociously. British forces get bogged down. Bitter fighting in the Normand hedgerows and villages. American observers start to criticize. Is Montgomery too slow? Is the British Army not aggressive enough? But here's what's actually happening. The British and Canadian forces around Caen are facing the bulk of the German armored strength in Normandy. Panzerlehr Division, 12th SS Panzer Division, 21st Panzer Division. Elite German units are hammering the British sector. And by tying them down, by grinding through them in brutal attritional combat, the British are making it possible for the Americans to achieve their breakout at St. Lo. It's a role that requires taking punishment. It requires holding ground against counterattacks. It requires a kind of grim determination that doesn't make for exciting headlines, but wins wars. By late July, the Americans break through. Operation Cobra sends Patton's Third Army racing across France. And when the Germans try to counterattack at Falaise, they're caught between the Americans from the south and the British and Canadians from the north. The Falaise Pocket. Thousands of German troops killed, wounded, or captured. German Army Group B, which had defended Normandy, effectively ceases to exist as a fighting force. Liberation of France accelerates. Paris is freed in August. By September, Allied forces are approaching the German border. The British Army rolls through France and Belgium, liberating Brussels, fighting toward the Netherlands. But now comes one of the most controversial operations of the war, one that will test the British Army's capability and show its limits. Operation Market Garden, September 1944. Montgomery's plan to end the war by Christmas. Drop airborne forces, American, British, and Polish, to seize bridges across the rivers of the Netherlands. Then drive armored forces up a single highway to cross the Rhine at Arnhem and pour into Germany's industrial heartland. It's bold, audacious, some say brilliant, others say it's doomed from the start. The American 101 Airborne takes Eindhoven. The American 82nd Airborne takes Nijmegen, after fierce fighting. But at Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division lands into a hornet's nest. Unknown to Allied intelligence, 2 SS Panzer divisions are refitting near the city. The British paratroopers fight with extraordinary courage. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and his battalion hold the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge for 4 days against overwhelming German forces. They're surrounded, outnumbered, running low on ammunition, taking heavy casualties. But they hold. Because they're ordered to hold. Because they're British paratroopers, and retreat isn't in their vocabulary. The ground forces, led by the British XX Corps, fight their way up that single highway. It's called Hell's Highway because German forces attack the column from both sides. Progress is slower than planned. By the time they reach Nijmegen, it's too late for the men at Arnhem. After 9 days of fighting, the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division are evacuated across the Rhine. Of the 10,000 British and Polish troops who landed at Arnhem, only about 2,000 make it out. The rest are dead or captured. Market Garden fails. The Rhine isn't crossed. The war won't end in 1944. Critics hammer Montgomery and the British Army. Was the plan too ambitious? Was the intelligence flawed? Was the execution too cautious? All fair questions. But here's what gets lost. Those paratroopers at Arnhem fought with a courage that earned respect even from the Germans. When the remnants surrender, German officers salute them. That's the British Army at its best. Not invincible, not superhuman, but absolutely unwilling to quit. Winter 1944-1945. The war grinds on. In December, the Germans launched their last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. The main weight falls on American forces, and the American soldiers who hold Bastogne and blunt the German offensive are rightly celebrated as heroes. But British forces also engage. Montgomery takes command of the northern shoulder of the Bulge, and British troops help contain the German breakthrough. It's a supporting role, but a necessary one. By January, the German offensive is defeated. Not by one army, but by the combined Allied forces, American, British, Canadian, French, all working together. The final push into Germany begins in early 1945. British forces cross the Rhine in late March as part of Operation Plunder, a massive set-piece assault supported by American troops. Together, the Western Allies drive deep into Germany. British forces push toward Hamburg and the Baltic. Americans drive toward the Elbe, toward Berlin. Soviet forces close from the east. The Third Reich is collapsing. May 4, 1945. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery accepts the surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands at his headquarters on Lüneburg Heath. 3 days later, the war in Europe ends. The British Army, which started the war evacuating from Dunkirk, ends it accepting the surrender of German forces. That's a measure of capability. That's a measure of resilience. But the story doesn't end in Europe. There's another theater where the British Army fought, often overlooked in American accounts, where they faced a brutal, unforgiving enemy in some of the worst conditions imaginable: Burma. The Burma Campaign, 1942 to 1945, is called the Forgotten War because it received so little attention compared to Europe or the Pacific Island hopping campaigns. But for the British and Commonwealth forces who fought there, it was hell. Dense jungle, disease, monsoons, and an enemy, the Japanese, who were masters of jungle warfare and fought with fanatical determination. The Japanese invade Burma and drive British forces back into India in a chaotic retreat. It's a humiliating defeat. The British Army looks incapable of stopping the Japanese advance. But then something changes. New commanders arrive. William Slim takes over the 14th Army, what he'll call the Forgotten Army, and Slim transforms it. He focuses on jungle training, on small unit tactics, on air supply, using American transport aircraft to keep his forces supplied deep in the jungle where there are no roads. He rebuilds morale, telling his soldiers that they're better than the Japanese, that they can beat them at their own game. And then he proves it. The Japanese launch Operation Yugo, attempting to invade India through Impol and Kohima. British and Indian forces stand firm. The siege of Impol and the Battle of Kohima are desperate affairs. Outnumbered defenders holding hilltop positions against repeated Japanese assaults. Hand-to-hand fighting in some of the fiercest combat of the entire war. But the British don't break. Supplied by air, reinforced at the critical moment, they hold. And then they counterattack. The Japanese offensive collapses. Starving, decimated by disease, the Japanese army retreats back into Burma, and the British 14th Army pursues. Over the next year, Slim conducts a masterful campaign, outmaneuvering the Japanese, cutting their supply lines, destroying their forces piecemeal. In May 1945, Rangoon is recaptured. The Japanese in Burma are finished. William Slim will later say that the 14th Army was the finest fighting force the British ever produced. Multi-ethnic, British, Indian, Gurkha, African troops all welded into a single, highly effective army. They proved that the British Army could learn, could adapt, could take on the Japanese in the jungle and win decisively. So, how capable was the British Army in World War II? Let's be honest. They started the war unprepared. They suffered devastating defeats in France, in Greece, in North Africa, in the Far East. Their equipment was often inferior to German armor and weaponry. Their doctrine was sometimes outdated. Their leadership was uneven. Some commanders were brilliant, others were mediocre at best. But here's the other side of the ledger. They held the line alone against Nazi Germany from June 1940 until December 1941, when America entered the war after Pearl Harbor. That's a year and a half of standing firm when every rational calculation said they should have collapsed. They rebuilt after Dunkirk. They learned from their defeats. They adapted their tactics, improved their equipment, found better leaders. They won at El Alamein. They fought through Italy's mountains. They stormed the beaches of Normandy alongside American forces and ground through the German defenses. They crossed the Rhine. They liberated Northwest Europe. They defeated Japan in Burma. And they did all of this while their nation was being bombed, while their economy was stretched to breaking point, while they were dependent on American supplies and support to keep going. The British Army of 1945 was a vastly more capable fighting force than the British Army of 1939. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened through hard learning, painful adaptation, and the courage of soldiers who kept fighting even when the odds looked impossible. Were they as powerful as the American Army by war's end? No. The United States put millions of men into the field, backed by the most productive economy in human history. American innovation, American industry, American fighting spirit played the decisive role in winning the war. That's historical fact. Without American involvement, Britain could not have won. Churchill knew it. Every British soldier knew it. The Atlantic Partnership, the special relationship between Britain and America, was forged in the fires of World War II because both nations recognized they needed each other. But within that partnership, the British Army proved itself to be a highly capable force. Not superhuman, not invincible, but professional, resilient, and ultimately victorious. They held the line until America could fully mobilize. They provided battle-hardened divisions for the invasion of Europe. They contributed crucial forces to the strategic bombing campaign, to the naval war, to operations across 3 continents. And individual British soldiers fighting in the deserts, the jungles, the cities, and the beaches showed the same courage and determination as their American brothers in arms. Think about this. At Caen, British soldiers were facing the same SS Panzer divisions that had terrorized Europe for years. At Arnhem, British paratroopers held a bridge for days with no hope of relief. In Burma, British and Indian troops fought in conditions that would break most men, and won anyway. That's capability, not measured in propaganda or national pride, but measured in battlefield results. The lesson of the British Army in World War II isn't about who was better, America or Britain. That's the wrong question. The lesson is about what free nations can accomplish when they stand together, when American industry supports British determination, when British experience guides American enthusiasm, when soldiers from democracies around the world unite against tyranny. The generation that won World War II, American, British, Canadian, French, Soviet, and so many others, didn't win because any single nation was invincible. They won because they formed a coalition, because they learned to work together, because they adapted and persevered and refused to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. The British Army played its part in that victory. Not the only part, not even the largest part, but an essential part. And the soldiers who served in it, from Dunkirk to VE Day, earned their place in history. So the next time you think about D-Day, remember that British soldiers were there too, charging into German guns, fighting to liberate Europe. The next time you think about the defeat of Nazi Germany, remember that British forces were in the fight from the first day to the last. And the next time someone asks how capable the British Army was in World War II, you'll know the answer. They were capable enough to survive their darkest hour, capable enough to learn from defeat, capable enough to fight alongside the American forces that would ultimately tip the balance, and capable enough to be standing there, victorious, when the war finally ended. That's the story history doesn't always tell. That's the truth about the warriors who stood beside America's greatest generation. And that's why these stories matter. If this history moved you, if you believe in honoring all those who fought for freedom, hit that subscribe button. Because there are more untold stories from World War II waiting to be discovered, more acts of courage that deserve to be remembered. The men who fought in that war, British and American alike, didn't do it for glory. They did it for each other, for their countries, for freedom. We owe it to them to remember.